אדון עולם אשר מלך בטרם כל יציר נברא לעת נעשה.
The remission of sin in Jesus' death on the cross. Why did Jesus die on the cross? This question is buried beneath 2,000 years of history, 2 millennia of church doctrine, and the initial shock and confusion of his most beloved disciples and family. The meaning of Jesus' death on the cross takes us, the modern-day asker, through Albert Schweitzer's question of The Quest of the Historical Jesus, published in 1906. How do we navigate the mythology of the New Testament to excavate the true Jesus? It is hard, if impossible, to completely discern what is historical and mythology. Still, we can find evidence that suggests the early disciples, those who witnessed the life and ministry of Jesus, including the successor of the church, the brother of Jesus, James, thought regarding the theological meaning of Jesus' death on the cross. Throughout the gospel narratives, we encounter a consistent message about the theological significance of Jesus' death on the cross. It is repeatedly described as a ransom for our sins. This is explicitly stated in Mark 10:45 and Matthew 20:28, where Jesus himself declares, "The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." But we have to remember, Mark and Matthew arrive on the scene 30 to 50 years after the life and death of Jesus, giving the writers who aren't the disciples plenty of time to develop an answer to why Jesus died on the cross. After all, how could God allow the pagan Romans to kill such a beloved, honest, righteous, pious, and loving man? Moreover, the earliest literary attestation of Jesus' death, which was for the remission of sin according to mainstream Christian theology, can be found in the Pauline epistles. 1 Corinthians 15:3, "For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures." In 2 Corinthians 5:21, "God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God." In some of our earliest surviving Pauline letters, Corinthians 55 to 58 AD, Paul clearly communicates his belief that Jesus died for the remission of humanity's sins. Still, Paul writes to us some quarter century after the crucifixion of Jesus, a man he never knew in life. In the letter to the Hebrews, which the church attributes to Paul, he writes to the Hebrews in chapter 9:26, "But he has appeared once for all at the culmination of the ages to do away with sin by the sacrifice of himself." The book of Hebrews again describes Jesus' death not only as for sin, but as the culmination of sins throughout history. Then the author Hebrews finalizes this view in chapter 10, stating in verses 10 to 12, "And by that will we have been made holy through the sacrifice of the body of Jesus Christ once and for all. Day after day, every priest stands and performs his religious duties. Again and again, he offers the same sacrifices, which can never take away sins. But when this priest had offered for all time one sacrifice for sins, he sat down at the right hand of God." Now, consider the scene in the book of Acts. Multiple times we have been told, or it's inferred, that the disciples prayed and performed sacrifices at the temple well after Jesus' death on the cross. Peter and John are mentioned in Acts 3 explicitly going to the temple to pray at 3 o'clock, which is the midday or mincha prayer requiring Jews to bring the Tamid sacrifice, which was an offering made twice daily, once in the morning, shachrit, and once in the afternoon, mincha. These sacrifices were intended to be offered without interruption every day of the year, including Sabbaths and festivals. Additionally, it was considered a foundational aspect of the temple service, symbolizing the continual relationship between God and the people of Israel. It was a daily reminder of the people's dedication to God and served as a form of atonement and sanctification. See the book of Exodus 29:38 to 42 and the book of Numbers 28 1 to 8. Furthermore, in the book of Acts 21:17 to 26, Paul visits Jerusalem and is told by James, the brother of Jesus, and the elders to join 4 men in completing a Nazirite vow, which involved rituals including the sin offering of sacrifices at the temple to demonstrate that Paul was not teaching Jews to abandon the law of Moses in the aftermath of Jesus' death. Acts 21:26 states, "Then Paul took the men, and the next day, having been purified with them, entered the temple to announce the expiration of the days of purification, at which time an offering should be made for each one of them." Think about what's happening here. The book of Hebrews claims Jesus is the ultimate and final sacrifice. It would be absolutely shocking and almost blasphemous if Jesus died for the remission of sin and his disciples were still bringing routine and frequent sin offerings to the temple. Yet, the early Christians were bringing sin sacrifices well after Jesus' death on the cross. And remember, the temple stood 40 years after Jesus' death. That's a whole human lifetime in the first century. And they would at least participate in the Tamid sacrifice twice a day during that time. This is a massive indicator that the disciples clearly didn't see Jesus' death on the Roman cross as the last and ultimate sacrifice, because if they did, then why would they continue to bring sin sacrifices to the temple? But even more shockingly, if they are bringing sin sacrifices at all, this means Jesus' death didn't cover their sins in the first place. Therefore, Jesus did not die for anyone's sins. This was a belief that had to develop later as a way to reconcile the brutal and hideous murder of such a righteous man. Even more interesting, Paul is the most Hellenized of the apostles, and even he brings a sin sacrifice. In Acts, notice Paul brings the offering to demonstrate a continuity of function, not simply a one-time test to if he will make a sacrifice, but that he upholds the law of Moses and continues to sacrifice. What's more interesting about this piece is that we see then the top 4 heads of the church following Jesus' death, James, John, Peter, and Paul, bringing sin offerings to the temple, meaning that sin sacrifices survived the compromise at the council in Jerusalem. At the Council of Jerusalem, the early church confronted the problem of ritualistic observances among Jews and non-Jewish Christians with no mention of sacrifices. This suggests that all the disciples who uncontroversially accepted Jesus' death had no functional or compulsory effect on the sacrificial system or the atonement for their sins. Moreover, Jesus was a rabbi, making him a religious Torah observant Jew, enabling readers to understand Jesus's likely level of commitment and participation in deeply religious traditions such as the temple sacrifice, and who no doubt led his congregates to follow him similarly. Likewise, throughout the New Testament, we are told that Jesus and the disciples observed the Jewish holidays, such as during the Passover, Feast of Unleavened Bread, Feast of Weeks, Shavuot, Feast of Tabernacles, Sukkot, and the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, all which requiring much higher religious importance in terms of observance and performing offerings for sin sacrifices than during the Mincha prayer or the Nazirite vow that Paul takes. On the other hand, it would be nearly inconceivable that Jesus and the disciples would have celebrated these holidays untraditionally without offering sin sacrifices, especially since Jesus does many unconventional things and justifies them, such as picking grain on Shabbat. And it goes without saying that Jesus routinely has to justify himself to people accusing him of breaking the law of Moses because of such actions. So, how could Jesus or his disciples go without full participation in the high holidays, without this being an issue with other observant sects like the Pharisees, Sadducees, Zealots, or Essenes? If the early Christians hadn't brought sacrifices following the law of Moses, then surely Jesus would have been in the proverbial hot seat that Paul was sitting in. Still, instead of James, it would be the other Jews questioning Jesus why he is leading people away from the law of Moses. Jesus is never charged with getting people to stop following the law of Moses, and he always refers back to a rabbinic style of interpretation of the law when issues of observance come up. Not only does no one charge Jesus with undoing the law of Moses, but neither do any Jews, Jewish Christian, or Gentile Christian bring up the issue of performing sacrifices, or that the Jesus movement has altered their observance of ritual sacrifice in any manner. In fact, Jesus assures us that he and his movement take a conservative and strict stance on adherence to the law when he tells us in Matthew 5, "For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or stroke shall pass from the law until all is accomplished." Meaning, like being baptized for the remission of sin to fulfill all righteousness, he too had to bring sacrifices as directly stated in the law. In contrast, baptism isn't in the Hebrew Bible at all. Contextually, this means during Jesus' life and ministry, he and his followers brought offerings and sacrifices to the temple for the remission of sin, guilt, thankfulness, and purification daily. And more theologically significant, given the scriptural evidence in the book of Acts of the disciples' sacrificial offerings, it is clear that nothing about the death on the cross or Jesus' acclaimed resurrection 3 days later affected the need to bring sacrifices for the redemption of sin, leaving us with the powerful impression that Jesus and the disciples did not understand his life nor death as altering the process for having their sins forgiven.
Elecha v'nashu